The universe of Runeterra Prime began with an unknown spark. This event created the Celestials, which were the observers and builders within the known universe, as well as their counterparts, the Void, which were unconscious entities sleeping undisturbed at the beginning of time. Eventually, the Void were awoken by the lights, sounds, and other creations of the Celestials. This awakening of the Void from their eternal slumber by the Celestials would set off a universal conflict between these two groups of powerful entities that remains ongoing into modern times. Aurelion Sol was one of the first beings to come into existence during the universe's creation. As they wandered this new barren universe, Aurelion Sol and the other Celestials wanted to create something out of the vast nothingness which surrounded them. Aurelion Sol began to fill this empty space with the first lights of the universe, one of which would become Runeterra's sun. While navigating the cosmos, Aurelion Sol happened upon a world which he had never seen before. The Aspects, who are basically the eternal gods of Runeterra Prime, took notice of this world as well, and they learned that this new realm was filled with life, magic, and civilization. The beings of this new world called out to the heavens above, seeking guidance from the Celestials. As Aurelion Sol descended upon this newfound land, he learned that the world was called Targon, and that the people of Targon worshipped him. The Aspects demanded that the mortals bring gifts to Aurelion Sol to show their gratitude for his presence. In order to bestow these gifts upon Aurelion Sol, the mortals of Targon traveled to the top of their highest mountain peak in order to get as close as possible to the celestial realm. At the top of the mountain, the mortals of Targon presented Aurelion Sol with the gift of a magical ornamented crown. As Aurelion Sol donned this crown, it immediately clamped down onto its head and began to extract the knowledge of the stars from him. In this struggle, a burst of power erupted from the crown and knocked Aurelion Sol back into the heavens. Though he was never able to return to the physical realm of Targon again, Aurelion Sol is tethered to Mount Targon, where he remains as a tool used by the Aspects. Using the powers and knowledge stolen from Aurelion Sol, the Aspects would command the mortals of Targon to construct a sun disk, which they would use to bestow great powers upon their warriors, readying themselves for some unforeseen battle to come. Throughout history, the Aspects have called upon Aurelion Sol in times of desperation, and they have been able to command his will to do their bidding through the dominating forces of the crown. Once, a female Aspect, going by the mantle of Pantheon, was able to call upon Aurelion Sol and command him to close the portals of the Voidborn that were infiltrating the world of Targon. Using the power of one of the stars that he created, Aurelion Sol was able to close off the interdimensional void portals and bury the remaining Voidborn deep under the crust of Targon. In this process, Aurelion Sol destroyed many of the mortals who worshipped him, as well as the aspect known as Pantheon, and the star that was used in the process of this battle. Over time, he has witnessed the fall of the Sun Disk, the creation of another even more powerful than the first, and eventually several wars between the various enemies of the Targonian god warriors, until they finally ended up fighting amongst themselves. As time passed, Targon and the god warriors became weak, and the world became ravaged by magical forces. As the Aspects grew weaker, so too did the powers of Aurelion Sol's confining crown. Aurelion Sol is beginning to notice that the powers that the Aspects use to control him are slowly diminishing over time, and he is beginning to plot his revenge and eventual return to the physical realm of Targon. Chunks of the crown are beginning to fall from his head, becoming comets in the emptiness of space. Nearly free from his exile from Targon, now known as Runeterra, Aurelion Sol seeks revenge upon those who stole his knowledge and outcast him from this world. Bard is another celestial who emerged from the universe's spark of creation. From the beginning of time, Bard drifted silently through the universe, until Aurelion Sol began crafting stars, which emitted the first sounds of existence. As Bard traveled between the stars to experience these new noises, he encountered the small wisps of energy left over from the star's creation. These small motes of energy, called meeps, would follow him as Bard added his own notes to the star's musical nature. The meeps would lead Bard to places in the universe where the music was either missing or slightly out of tune, and seeking reasons as to why these celestial notes became misplaced, Bard would eventually come across a world which had a much different rhythmic pattern. Bard had discovered an early primitive Runeterra. Although he could appreciate the dissonant melody coming from this newfound planet, he also saw this world's song as disruptive to the surrounding space. Bard entered the material realm of the First Lands, now known as Ionia, and immediately became overwhelmed by the intense physical forces put upon his celestial form. So he crafted himself a physical body out of cloth, knickknacks, and a mask from a traveling musician's caravan. As Bard traveled Runeterra throughout history, he noticed that the noises of this world were unnatural, and that they were caused by something or someone from the celestial realm, but for what purpose, he could not determine. Although Bard has not solved the case of who or what is causing these misplaced notes, he has taken it upon himself to return these out-of-place celestial objects back to where they came from, in order to correct the symphony of the universe. Tales of this strange-looking man would travel across the lands of Runeterra, some believing that the wandering caretaker was a god to be worshipped, while others simply shrugged these rumors off as myth. There are some who not only believe that Bard exists, but who also seek to aid him in returning metals and misplaced objects back to the worlds which they come from. One such believer from Demacia, known as the Balladeer, recounts an experience that he had with his late mother's wind chime. Thought to be a family heirloom, one day this wind chime began acting strange, and as the man went to investigate, he witnessed a meep absorbing the celestial elements from this centuries-old wind chime. As the wind chime held sentimental value to the man, he reached out to try to stop the meep from taking the wind chime through an interstellar portal. Immediately, the man was pulled up through the portal into the sky and eventually landed in the domain of the Bard. The Balladeer then breaks into song about his experiences with the Bard, explaining how he showed the Balladeer different aspects of time, space, and other dimensions. He goes on to describe himself becoming a meep and his travels through the void, where there exists no light or sound. The Balladeer claims that the Bard sent him back to Runeterra and tasked him with examining metals in order to determine whether they were of this world, or if they needed to be returned back to their celestial home. Whether this Balladeer is actually a disciple of Bard, or perhaps just a creative grifter, we cannot be certain, but this tale is interesting, and his story leads me to believe that this is how we might encounter Bard during the events of the Riot MMO. As early civilization began to develop on Runeterra, other Celestials became curious. The Celestials grew concerned that these mortals were disrupting their own fates through the use of free will, so one Celestial, Soraka, decided to descend among the mortals to see if she could help repair these disrupted timelines. As Soraka lived among the mortals, she began to feel herself weakening, but she was willing to sacrifice her celestial strength in order to set these mortals on their correct paths. However, as she spent more time with them, Soraka realized that these mortals weren't necessarily breaking away from their destinies, but rather forming new ones. With this realization, Soraka decided to stop trying to set Runeterrans on their correct paths, and instead become a guide to help them decide which paths to take. As Soraka is able to see the potential future timelines of mortals, she is often visited by those who might want a glimpse into their potential futures. Since the mortals of Runeterra have free will, Soraka isn't able to tell the exact future, but she is able to tell someone how their life might turn out if they choose to make certain decisions. In one case, during the Noxian invasion of Ionia, Soraka is visited by an Ionian Vestaya named Kalan. Soraka tells Kalan of the two paths of his fate, one in which he fights against Noxus and defends his people, but loses his family in the process. On the other path, Kalan betrays the people of Ionia, defeating them in battle and climbing up the ranks as a Noxian military leader. On this path, Soraka tells Kalan that he will never see his family again, but she reveals that they will live happy and prosperous lives without him. As Soraka has made an oath to herself to no longer attempt to correct the fates of mortals, she remains a somewhat neutral figure in Runeterra Prime, only showing others their possible futures, without giving input or advice as to which path they should take. While Soraka is careful not to influence the decisions of mortals, she does intervene in order to lend aid when she encounters those who are suffering. Soraka is an empath, so she is able to sense when others are injured or in emotional distress. This trait is what drives Soraka to help those in need. For example, while living near the base of Mount Targon, Soraka encountered a pack of wolves surrounding a young girl, who was on her pilgrimage to the mountain's summit. As the wolves turned on Soraka, she used her celestial abilities to scare off most of the pack, but crippled one of the wolves in the process. Soraka was able to feel the wolf's agony, so she approached it, lending her healing energy to repair its mangled body and broken bones. As the resuscitated wolf scurried away, Soraka turned her attention to the young girl who the wolves were hunting. Soraka immediately becomes flooded with the pain being experienced by the young girl, and realizes that the girl's hands up to her elbows are completely frostbitten. Soraka is easily able to repair the flesh of this young girl, and immediately the girl regains feeling and mobility in her arms. In all of the time that Soraka has resided in Runeterra, she has traveled to all corners of the world in order to heal those in need. From reversing frostbite in the Freljord to cleansing the chemical damage done to the lungs of the people of Zaun, Soraka has been there to support the mortals of Runeterra all throughout history. Currently, Soraka continues to live near Mount Targon, where she trains a tribe of Vestaya in the ways of celestial healing. So how might these celestial champions tie into the upcoming Riot MMO? Well, since Soraka is currently based in Targon, training a tribe of healers, I imagine that she'll play a big role in the late game progression of healing classes. I could see Soraka being a quest giver, helping others reach the summit of Mount Targon, and generally progressing the storyline of that area. Since she is known to be a bit of a traveling healer, I can also see her relocating to areas where the newest endgame content is happening. In her role as a seer, she could give us glimpses into the future of the storyline, and help the other story-relevant characters choose between world-changing paths. While I don't expect Bard to be a massive part of the overall storyline of the Riot MMO, I do see a possibility where players are sent on side quests in order to find out-of-place celestial items hidden throughout the world of Runeterra. This could be horizontal collection content that players could participate in throughout the leveling process and well into the endgame. I'm thinking that these misplaced celestial materials will be kind of like Mokoko seeds from Lost Ark, where the more we find, the more we are rewarded with horizontal content such as mounts, skins, and titles. If there is an expansion later down the line where the Void becomes the main villain of the Riot MMO, then I could see Bard becoming a more primary figure within the storyline. But since the Void and the Watchers are really the highest form of endgame boss, I don't expect us to face them in the initial version of the upcoming MMO. But speaking of raid bosses, I can definitely see a case to be made for Aurelion Sol being an early tier raid boss. Since he has been held captive by the aspects for so long, he has become super bitter and angry, justifiably so. I think that Mount Targon will be an endgame zone with dungeons and raids, leading to the peak of the mountain where we'll face off against Aurelion Sol. Since the aspects still have some control over him through the use of the crown, they might be able to control him enough to prevent him from obliterating us and the rest of the world. However, I can see a path where Aurelion Sol fights us just long enough to trick us into destroying this crown, freeing him from the grasp of the aspects, but not necessarily taking his anger out on the mortals in the world of Runeterra. But I think that if and when we fight Aurelion Sol, it will not be to kill him, but to free him from the constraints of the aspects, and to recruit his aid to help us fight back against the Void in a future expansion. But those are just some of my theories about how we'll see the Celestials in the upcoming Riot MMO. What do you think? I'd love to hear any fan theories or lore that I may have missed. I know that Soraka is also present in the Ruination storyline, but I'll leave that, as well as a longer discussion about the history of the Void, for future videos. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.